Now, how do we ensure appropriate retention with regard to asset security? Different types of data have different retention requirements. Obviously, as part of our data management practice, we need to understand where the data exists, how long that data needs to be retained for. We need to define the data specifically. How do we archive and manage that data? We need to make sure that we're involving all stakeholders to align business and legal requirements for our data retention policies. All right. Now, oftentimes the data owner will define our data retention policy, but other aspects of input need to be considered, right? Stakeholders are typically either the custodians of the information or the users of the information, or it could even be somebody offering input as to what type of retention requirements we might have for legal purposes, right? Financial records, for example. Your accountant and your legal team would tell you, how long do you have to maintain records of financial transactions in case you get audited by the IRS or something to that effect. So, if there's a criminal investigation, a legal hold has been placed on information, we need to identify the parameters of that legal hold, which is, part of a data retention strategy, albeit for a very specific purpose, but there are requirements for that. What are the objectives for supporting archiving? So they're talking about retention here in the sense of long-term. What are our retention best practices? How do we monitor and review and update the documented data retention policies and archiving procedures, right? I mean, in the end, data retention really just defines overall the policies for persistent data, for records management, data archival requirements, and so on. And sometimes this can be a directive, right? The Data Protection Act, for example, identifies specific types of data and how that data needs to be managed. But if I am defining a data retention policy, almost always there's going to be some legal aspect to that retention policy. There are going to be some different privacy concerns about that data because it's being stored for a period of time. That's going to get weighed against the economics of storing that information, as well as our need to know concerns that will ultimately decide what the retention times are going to be, what the archival rules are going to be, what is the format of the data, what are the means for storage, and ultimately, is there a need to access that information? Is there a need to encrypt that information, and so on? Many different areas that might require data retention. Maybe it's call detail records for a call center. Maybe it's log files for a website that's being visited by the public. Maybe it's emails that are being sent and received. It could be geolocation information. There's all kinds of reasons, right? From the government perspective, oftentimes we're retaining data to do surveillance or to do, traffic analysis. So we need to make sure that the data is accurate, right? We don't want somebody being accused of criminal activity because of inaccurate information or inaccurate data. In a commercial sense, data is typically going to be stored for business reasons, not necessarily criminal activity investigations or oversight investigations or whatnot, but mainly for identifying transactions that are occurring, maybe sales on a website, and so on. There are policies that have to be identified. And this will definitely change depending on the region that you're in. Each region has their own requirements for how we retain information. But a data retention policy is a policy that is established within an organization that defines how we retain information for operational use within the organization, making sure that we are in adherence with laws and regulations based on the type of data that's being retained. Overall, the objective of a data retention policy is to keep information that's important for a specific period of time for future use or future reference, to be able to organize that information so it can be easily accessible or searchable at a later date, and then to dispose of that information when that information is no longer needed. All right? So they talk about kind of defining different retention requirements, understanding where data exists, classifying the defined data, and so on. That's all part of that data retention policy. And the data retention policy is really just a defined set of guidelines that allows us to decide which data is going to be archived, how long it's going to be kept, what happens to the data at the end of its retention period. Is it going to be further archived, maybe into a different archive, kind of a longer term archive? Is it going to be destroyed, and so on? But the effective component of any data retention policy is ultimately the permanent deletion of that data or the retained data itself. Secure deletion is a really, really important concept. We'll talk about that in quite a bit, a little bit later on in this section here, actually. All right, and you can go and read different data retention regulations and policies. For banking data, for vehicle movement data, for postal data, depending on what's being collected, you're not going to need to know all of the specific geo or sovereignty information, right? For subscriber information, for telephony data, and so on, phone records, etc. But in general, these are the concerns that we have with data retention, right? What are the 8 steps to a retention policy? Evaluate the statutory requirements, the litigation obligations, and business needs. Now, statutory requirements could be regulatory requirements or industry-specific requirements or whatnot, government requirements. But what about litigation obligations, right? Oftentimes, archived data is used in litigation, either civil or criminal litigation matters. And in order for that data to be admissible, you have to maintain a chain of custody, right? You have to understand or maintain the chain of custody is basically who's had access to the data, how can we ensure the integrity of that data during its life cycle. If the data has moved from one person to another, was that documented appropriately, and so on. In other words, making sure that there was really no way for that data to be modified at any point in its life cycle. That's when they're talking about litigation obligations. That's what they're referring to. Classify types of records, determine retention periods and destruction practices, draft and justify our record retention policies, make sure that everybody's trained and aware, right, on what those policies are. Audit the retention and the destruction practices, make sure they're effective. Review all your policies because they can change over time. And of course, document the policy, the implementation of the policy, and the training and audits process. Okay? Most likely, you're going to retain large amounts of data, so classify that data into searchable categories. And that's an important concept, because ultimately, if we are archiving information, there's a need to access that information at some point, right? The need to store the information would ultimately mean that at some point we would need to access that information. So we need to make sure that we have a searchable way or an efficient way to access that information. All right. We still want to make sure that we are applying data security principles, data privacy principles. We'll talk about things like the Data Retention Directive, which is a European Union directive for data retention practices, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Retain records for a period defined by law, especially if they're like financial records or transactional records that are required, for compliance to safety standards or accounting practices and so on. Do not destroy records required for litigation. Any record that's required for litigation would be put on what we call legal hold. Legal hold means that you're required to maintain that information for a period of time. These are terms that you kind of see in just about any, security class or whatnot. Basically, legal hold means we're trying to preserve the form of the information, right? For evidentiary solicitation. Draft a retention policy and outline classification of records, retention and destruction schedules, responsible parties, and the procedures for destruction. Define specific justifications for the rules and the policies. Right? That's important, right? We need to follow these rules and regulations, or these rules and these policies, because it's mandated by this directive. Either we have a contractual obligation with our business partners, or we have a legal obligation based on the type of business that we're in, right? If I'm a credit card, if I'm a retailer and I'm processing credit card information, it can almost be the opposite. We have specific retention policies that restrict the type of information that we can retain, as opposed to what we were supposed to retain, right? Training on rules and policies is paramount. Always training is going to be an aspect of any policy. Auditing is always going to be an aspect of any policy. Policies are never static. They're living and breathing things. They're going to be new laws. We're going to be implementing new technology, possibly even having different data types. So we have to consider those changes and how they're going to affect our overall retention policies.